Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to, our first look at the 2022 House elections. And I'm going to be periodically updating this map and all that stuff. And we're going to go with the districts that we have. Now, if you look at 538, and they're keeping track, the map in Georgia hasn't been signed into law just yet, but it certainly will be. And same with the New Mexico map. And we're going to go ahead and start going state by state for the states that do have maps. And this is kind of going to be a little bit of a discussion about how bad things are going to be for the Democrats. If we look at Alabama's, that one's safe, especially considering it is the South. In Alaska, I'm actually going to put it into the safe Republican category because I think all things considered, the national environment and all the other things, so it hasn't passed one. California is not. Colorado has. Move on to Colorado. And if we go here, let me look at the partisanship of each one as well. And this is kind of where I'm going to start discussing things because I think 2022 is going to be pretty bad for the Democrats. We've already seen it in a lot of special elections and the gubernatorial elections. It's kind of starting to add up to the Republicans just have a lot of good momentum on their side. And Democratic turnout may not be where it needs to be in order to compete. As it stands, a generic ballot, depending on who you listen to, the average shows between 1 and 3% Republican win nationally. Considering that the Democrats typically need about 5 to 7% in order to win the House, it's looking really bad for the Democrats. But there's also the factor that there's also the problem for Democrats, at least, that a lot of the issues right now are not lining up in their favor. And what do I mean? Let's start with the big one, inflation. When prices go up, people will take it out on the people in power. Voters will take it out on the people in power. It happened in the 70s with Carter. It happened, and it's going to continue to happen. Because of all the things that are vaguely affected by politics, inflation is the most noticeable. When you see the price for gas increase 30, 40, 50 cents a gallon, you notice that. When you see the price for a pound of hamburger go from, $1.50 to $2.50, you notice that. It's noticeable. And you'll look to the people in power. If they're either ignoring the problem, claiming it isn't a problem, or doing something that's failing to address the problem, you're going to want someone else in power. And right now, I don't think the Biden administration is taking inflation seriously. He claims they are, but continuing to not give incentives for businesses to keep hiring or to hire more truckers or keep ports open longer or, reopen some of the oil pipelines, those sorts of things. Yeah. And of course, if the government does nothing, people as individuals are going to demand higher wages. Makes sense, right? So that they can afford the higher prices. But of course, businesses, in order to afford the higher wages, are going to increase prices again. It's kind of self-fulfilling cycle. Once you get a little bit more than a normal amount of inflation, once you get a noticeable amount of inflation, it tends to be a very bad thing because it has a tendency to snowball for an amount of time, and then it if it does start snowballing, things can get really, really, really bad. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will. It's just we're at the point where if it's going to stop, it's going to stop. And I'm not seeing that it's going to stop for at least until the end of next year. I think prices are going to continue to rise at ridiculous rates. And some industries are being hurt more than others by this. Right now it's gas and groceries and that sort of thing. Last year it was building materials and building supplies. And I'm not even kidding when I say that. We saw prices for some goods quadruple. And that is absolutely noticeable. Let's just take a 2x4, right? I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but let's say a normal house is going to have about 300 2x4x8s in it, right? Just normal studs. Now, a builder typically has to pay out of pocket for these or through their business account, but a lot of builders are effectively gig workers. They're contract workers. They're contractors, right? So they do typically have to pay up front for the materials, and oftentimes it will be out of their own pockets. And builders have to build in order to put food on the table, so they can't not pay these prices. But let's say you had your cost increase of from about $3 to, at the peak last year, it was about $10 for a 248, a 2x4 stud. That's a $7 price increase. You're talking $2,100 just in 2x4s. To build a house. And like I said, that doesn't count the sheeting, the wiring, the hardware, the nails, any concrete, rebar, plumbing, and I could go on and on, the shingles. Drywall, anything for the interior. Not a joke. The sheeting on the outside, typically just 1/2-inch chipboard or 1/2-inch plywood. Price for that went from under $10. I'll just round up to 10. At least this is in my area. If some other areas, more expensive markets, of course, saw bigger price jumps. But in my area, we went from about $10 to about $50. And that's a lot. That's a $40 price increase. And to do a decent sized roof, you need you're probably going to need at least a unit of plywood in order to do the sheeting on the house and the roof. let's just say 100 sheets to make it nice and even. 100 sheets. And I'm not even counting subflooring and all that stuff. But just 100 sheets of half-inch plywood times 40, it's another $4,000 right there. Yeah. But it's not just, of course, a building industries thing. And I'm trying to harp on how noticeable price increases can be when I say that the Democrats are going to have a bad time. I'm actually willing to increase the third to pretty safe. The seventh is probably going to be leans or even a toss-up in Colorado. And I'm willing to say that the eighth is going to lean towards the GOP. I'm pretty confident in saying that right now. Colorado's redistricting commission put in a pretty fair map, so that's not actually. I'm going to drop the seventh to a toss-up. Looking at 538's partisan lean fixtures here, yeah, that's pretty reasonable. And, I mean, the third is already at the bare edge of safe, so Connecticut hasn't even proposed one. Delaware is going to be interesting. Now, Delaware doesn't have a redistricting. I'm putting it as likely because, but it is a fairly elastic state. Florida doesn't have one. Georgia does. And so I'm going to pull up that proposed map. Yep, okay. And outside of the Atlanta metro, it is pretty safe for the GOP. And this is the interesting one. You have Georgia's second, which is a VRA district. I think there is opportunity for the Republicans to flip it, but it's the nature of the type of voters who reside in this district. I think that Congressman Bishop is probably going to win that seat at the moment, but there's certainly opportunity for him to lose it. Certainly opportunity. I do really like how they. Hawaii doesn't have one. Idaho does, but that's pretty safe, and I don't really see that changing. Illinois has a map, and oh boy, is it a doozy. So, this abomination, the 13th, which is an open seat, I could actually see the Republicans just narrowly winning it. I'm actually pretty sure that the Republicans are going to narrowly win the 17th as well. I kind of hate saying it, but I think the Democrats kind of did a bit of a what in the community is called a dummy mander. They basically made it very difficult for themselves. And I could actually see the 14th flipping as well. The 6th might be a bit much, but it's actually slightly more competitive than the 14th, but it's in deep Chicago. The earmuff district is basically gone. But, oh my God, this is an abomination, to be honest with you. And that one's the 10th. Okay. There's a lot of really bad districts. And honestly, I'm going to drop down the 11th to Orleans. I really could see the Republicans picking up some seats in Illinois. I'd say 3 flips certainly, and that would give them that would give them 6 seats out of Illinois, which is probably better than I think most people would expect them to do. But I think there's certainly room for the Republicans to pick up at least 1 more, maybe 2 if they get really lucky. Go over to Indiana, and I'm pretty confident about this map being exactly like that. I don't see any reason Indiana would go differently. We go to Iowa, which is going to be fairly interesting. And genuinely, number one, because of how elastic Iowa is, I could see the Republicans picking up all 4 congressional districts. And the third I'm going to leave as a toss-up simply because incumbent is a Democrat there. But yeah, it could be very, very bad for the Democrats in Iowa. What's the next state to look at? Kansas doesn't have a map. Kentucky doesn't have one. Louisiana doesn't. Maine does. And if we look at it, Maine currently has 2 incumbent Democrats, Jared Golden up in the 2nd, and Shelley Pingree, I guess. And this is a year that Republicans will probably pick up the 2nd district. Again. Now we go to Maryland and this abomination. And to be honest, I'm pretty confident that the only seat that the Republicans are going to get is the 1st, which is, like I said, is an abomination. Massachusetts has a map. And I'm going to be honest, it is gerrymandered, but it's also hard to create even 1 Republican district, even though with, 9 districts? With 9 districts, there should be at least 3 Republican districts. Massachusetts, at least proportionally speaking, the problem is that Republican voters are very evenly spread out, pretty much in this area, minus the blue cities, and this area. And they also are there's a lot of blue in those areas too, so you can't really create a compact map with a Republican district. And there's so many Democrats in Massachusetts that they're spread, and the Democrats actually have very good geography in Massachusetts, and it's the Republicans that have terrible geography. So the Republicans just have no hope of winning a district in Massachusetts at the present. Michigan doesn't have a map just yet. Minnesota has no map. Mississippi has no map. Missouri has no map. Montana does. And we've got an open seat here. Montana's first, and the Montana second is pretty safe Republican. The second is, well, partisan lean shows. I'm pretty confident that the GOP is going to win that seat too, but it has potential to be a competitive seat in the future. Nebraska has a map, as does Nevada. And Don Bacon represents the 2nd district, the only competitive district, and I actually think he'll probably continue to win that seat. He's able to actually appeal to those voters, but I wouldn't put it as anything more than a lean. I think that's the right way to go. We go to Nevada, and I think they're being a little too kind to the Democrats. Second, I don't think is nearly that safe. I'd downgrade that. But at the same time, I'd also probably put the third in the leans GOP category, and both of those districts in the toss-up, or even better, I'd probably put the third as a toss-up too. Just to kind of emphasize the point, the Democrats decided, yes, we should give the Republicans a potential to win every single district in the state by splitting up Las Vegas. So I don't think that was a good idea from the Democrats. I think they should have kept Las Vegas as one district into and of itself as much as possible, and then dealt with it. Because the old map, the old map certainly had districts that could go towards the GOP. But the Democrats were doing just fine winning those. I think this was just, and I think the reason why it's a really bad idea is because the biggest other group in Nevada, other than white voters, is Hispanic voters, and that's a demographic that there's evidence to suggest that it's moving towards the Republican Party. So I'm a bit skeptical. I am a bit skeptical. And if we look at the map that's going to go through for New Mexico, again, it's a very similar story. Democrats decided to split Albuquerque and have it take a lot more rural territory. That made the district much less safe. I still think that I'm pretty confident that the incumbent there, Stansbury, is going to win. If we look at the other two districts, their partisanship is basically the same at about D+5 according to 538, which, okay, that there's a lot of data that they use, and they have a ton of it. I'm going to err on the side of the incumbent right now in the second, which means that Republicans could potentially continue to win that seat. And then the third, looking at the third district, I'm going to leave it as a toss-up. Because I think the Republicans, like I said, have the national environment to do it. But, and I don't really expect the first to be truly competitive. If it is, that's some very bad news for the Democrats. But I mean, it's also a state that Republicans theoretically could win all of them. New York doesn't have a map just yet. North Carolina does. And looking at it, right now, looking at it, that's reasonable. What's this one? There's enough suburban that, yeah. What is a person? I'm pretty sure about that. And that's the thing, is that North Carolina got heavily gerrymandered. There is very much another blue part of North Carolina right here that should warrant another Democratic district at least. But Republicans pretty much drawn an 11-3 map that I think will actually hold. So yeah. And of course, the previous map was a court-drawn map that had a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with potential for 2 more districts to go Democratic. But North Carolina Republicans don't have, North Carolina Democrats don't have the greatest geography, so grain of salt. The Dakotas, both are pretty safe. Ohio actually has a map. I think in a Republican year, that district is going to lean towards the GOP. 13th, yeah, I'm pretty sure about that one. That's about reasonable. Then, yeah, that one is pretty reasonable. And, yeah. I mean, Ohio's map is definitely gerrymandered, but it's kind of sneaky in that other than the first district in Cincinnati, it doesn't actually look as gerrymandered as you'd think, other than maybe the 5th and 9th over here. Cleveland's got its own district, and most of the others, this follows the Ohio River Valley, so does this district. These districts are just central. This one kind of snakes a little bit, and I think it's not as clean as it could be, but okay. It's a sneaky gerrymander is what I'm saying. Ohio, Oklahoma has one, and to be frank, it's all safe Republican. I don't really see, I don't see it as competitive in the slightest. Oregon. This is an interesting one. Obviously, the Democrats drew what in a neutral year would be a 5-1 map. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I think I think 270 to win is a little too focus, or not focus, but I think a little too generous to the Democrats. I think the Republicans have an opportunity to pick up potentially both of these seats. But for right now, I'm going to drop that there and that into the leans category. What's that one? Yeah, those are not changing. And the way they did this is they split the Portland area up. Portland County should be its own district. but the Democrats didn't do that. Whoa, I was about to sneeze there. I am so sorry about that. Nothing you can do about those, though. So after Oregon, Pennsylvania doesn't have a map. It has a proposed map. Rhode Island, South Carolina doesn't have one just yet. Tennessee doesn't have one just yet. Texas does. And we're definitely going to be doing some zooming in on this. So, let's start with the Dallas area. Because it's a bit of a mess. It is a bit of a mess. As you can see, the 13th is pretty ugly. The 25th is also pretty ugly. And the 30th is also really, really ugly. But all the other districts are, I mean, pretty darn safe. So if we move a little bit down and we look at the Houston area, what do we see here? Except, again, a case of safe, 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 safe. And then you have pretty safe districts in the 38th, new 38th, the 2nd, 36th, the 14th, and whatever district this is, the 22nd. So then we have to go all the way to Central Texas, South Central Texas technically. And looking at the 35th, the famous I-35 district, the 37th, I believe the 35th effectively is a new one. The 37th, just Austin. This is also Austin. And the 20th is also San Antonio. And you have the 21st, pretty safe. 27th, pretty safe. The 15th is pretty competitive, but I think the Republicans will probably hold it. And actually what I'm going to do is zoom out because you've got this open district, you've got Cuellar. I think Cuellar will continue to win. He's not really in real danger. And that's mostly because Cuellar is actually pretty popular. I think Tony Gonzalez. Yeah, Tony Gonzalez is probably going to keep his seat. But yeah, Cuellar is he's pretty popular. His district also encompasses a lot of blue area, and he's just a good fit for the district. So I think he'll win it. I think the Republicans have a very good opportunity to win the 15th. And I would agree with that. And the 34th is probably going to stay blue unless there is a massive shift in how Hispanic voters vote nationally. But that would also have to encompass urban Hispanic voters, not just the rural ones. Utah, pretty safe, to be honest with you. Don't really see any of that changing. And then, are there any other states that have finished we can talk about? Anything with competitive? So, no, it does not look like it. And if I go back to the national overview, this is where I currently see the map at for next November. Republicans right now, the states that have had their districting have about 116 seat to 64 advantage. Obviously, we're still waiting for California and New York to come in. I actually think Washington is pretty soon going to have a map because I think their Supreme Court has said that they want to keep what the commission was doing. New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island will help, but the Republicans have an opportunity in Connecticut for at least one district, unless you completely butcher Connecticut. And then, of course, Republicans have Missouri, Kansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida is going to come in at some point, and that's going to favor the GOP by a little bit. Wisconsin will actually be a pretty fairly drawn map. Virginia is going to be a fairly drawn map. Michigan's will be pretty fairly drawn. Minnesota's pretty fairly drawn. Pennsylvania's pretty fairly drawn. And we'll see about the others, of course. So who knows exactly what it'll be, but I think the Republicans definitely have the advantage in the House. In the Senate, we already kind of talked about that a little bit, but we're in midterm season now, so as we get more and more data about what districts are going to look like and what areas they're going to cover, I'm going to start doing a little bit more of this, and I'm going to make an attempt to predict every single House seat. And I'll keep a spreadsheet with my predictions. That way it all matches up. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy. Bye-bye.